Hubert Donahue. The interview is taking place at the Dayton Historical Depot, and this interview is being done under their auspices for the video history of Columbia County. All right, Hubert, I guess we just start out, you tell us when you were born and where.
Well, I was too loud. I was born in Columbia County. In fact, on our main ranch home, which is 16 miles east of Dayton, and the attending doctor who arrived by buggy that day, according to my parents, was a Dr. Will Day, who people know in this community. And that was in 1921, which makes me 69, quit very quickly approaching 70.
In the area where you were born is known as Highland, right?
It's known as the Highland area, and is just west of the Tucannon River, up on the top of the mountain, so to speak. It's about 3,000 feet, and this particular area was a combination of homesteads, approximately 11 different homesteads that my grandfather, Ernest Hopkins, put together back in starting about 1890 and on through 1910 and 15 and prior to World War I. So was the start of my life, was in that particular area.
Okay, you mentioned your grandparents, Hopkins. That would be on your maternal side, your mother's father. You recall, how many children they had, or about the year that maybe they homesteaded the area?
Well, going back, Ernest Hopkins, who married, her name was Nelia, actually taught school for a considerable amount of years over in the Pomeroy area, and taught school at what they called the Pataha School for several years. And during that period of time, he was homesteading areas and began to buy out people that had already homesteaded. And they had two children, two adopted children actually. Their names were Marguerite Hopkins at that time and Harold Hopkins. And those people are well known in this community.
Okay, getting to the paternal side of your family, I recall your father Dewey, but you recall your grandparents. Would you care to say when they came to the Columbia County and why they came and where they settled?
Well, my grandfather and grandmother Donahue, whose names were Pat and Jenny, came from Missouri on a wagon train in the 1870s and arrived, first of all, I think they came in the Willamette Valley, and then they moved up to what is now known as the Tucannon area and homesteaded on the Cummins Creek area. And they came there for one reason, and they had a lot of family in the area. The family's names were Ogden, and which was my grandmother's maiden name. And so consequently, it was a natural thing for them to arrive and to homestead in an area where they had friends and family. And that was, like I say, in about the 1870s, they had 12 children. About 4 of them, Dewey, Dennis, Mike, and Joe, lived all their life, most of their life, in Columbia County and around Dayton. The rest of the children migrated, you might say, to the Spokane area. And as the years progressed, their relatives and their children have sort of become obscure as far as knowing who they are at this time in life.
Well, you know, Hubert, I've fished on the Cummings Creek, and I wonder how in the world did your grandparents make a living in that particular area? What did they grow? How did they dispose of what they grew?
Well, I've often wondered that myself, but the way that they made a living was he would go out and work in harvest time and odd jobs, manual labor, and of course they raised a huge garden and lived off of that. They had a cow, they had their butter, they had cheese, and they had their milk, of course, and eggs, and they didn't live very well. I remember one time going, when I was a very small boy, probably 5 or 6 years old, going to the old hen house and gathering eggs with my grandmother. And it was not a very lucrative area at that time, I can tell you.
Did they evidently did sell or trade produce? I mean, did they go to Pomeroy, or did they come to Dayton?
Basically, their groceries and things like that they bought in Pomeroy. And of course they had to travel by what they called a team and a hack, or a version of a buggy. And I don't remember them or any of my family ever saying that they sold anything. Maybe they sold a cow once in a while or some eggs and things like that, but I tell you, they lived pretty frugally during those years.
Okay, your early life experiences weren't quite the same as your grandparents or parents, but tell us a little bit about your early life on the farm, and perhaps how your parents practiced farming in those early days, some of the neighbors that lived on Highland.
Well, the Highland area especially was made up of several farms. There was the Searle farm, and the Cyrus farm, and the Macaulay farm, and the Hopkins farm, and the Henry farm, and the McGee farm, and they were all neighbors and jointly helped each other at different times throughout the year in harvest. And of course they all had the butchering when they butchered the hogs, and everybody would get together at all of their different places and go through that process. The harvest at that time was all done by the old-fashioned separator and teams of horses. At one time, my grandfather had 120 work horses that did the farming in that area. Because unlike today, where you have a tractor and pull maybe 9 or 10 bottoms, like the plows that they had back in those days had 6 horses and 2 and 3 bottoms. I have a picture of farming where there are 12 different teams in the area on one field, all one behind the other.
During harvest.
During the plowing part. During the plowing. So it was pretty old-fashioned, we would call it today, but it was labor was $1 a day for people and board, and I remember those days when I was a little boy. We always had 12 or so men around that my mother cooked for at that time, and it was quite an experience.
I know in that Highland area that there must have been some logging and perhaps a sawmill or two. Do you recall?
Yes, in fact my grandfather Hopkins had over the years several mills. He had one which up near Maloney Mountain, and then had 2 on Tucannon, one up near what we call Camp Wooten today, and the other one was down near where Murphy Russell lives on Tucannon. And that's one of the was one of the problems, investing in those mills and mortgaging the farm. So all of a sudden, when he found out that the lumber business was not that good, the price of wheat had gone down, and it was pretty hard to pay the bills back in those days. Now we're talking about in the 20s, and I think the last mill closed down about 1930. So that was an experience that he went through, that he was an entrepreneur. He wanted to do things and go big, and it turned out that it was not a very lucrative business.
Well, in those days, we didn't have the chainsaws, and I suppose that all the logging was done by the old crosscut and the teams of horses.
That's correct. Pulling the logs down, you bet. It's a little bit different than it is today.
Okay, now I know that the advent of electricity and the telephone occurred while you were still living with your parents on Highland. Do you have any recollection of perhaps when these came to Highland, or what changes it made for your family living?
Well, it made a lot of difference. Of course, we had the telephone, which was a party telephone line that ran about 15 miles to the city of Dayton at that time, which was kept up over the years by the people that used that particular line. And that was the old crank phone, and you had, I remember that our rings, that we used to call it on the phone, were two shorts. And when you heard that, why, you knew that somebody was on the line, wanted to visit. And there were lots of visiting that went on in those private lines back in those days. Electricity, I think, the REA came in, I believe it was about 1935. And of course, when that occurred, all of a sudden we did away with the old gas lights and the kerosene lanterns and so forth, and went to electricity. And I remember hanging those old cords from the ceiling, and of course we didn't have all the rules and regulations back then, so that there were live wires just taped around the ceiling to get the electricity to where you wanted it, to an outlet or whatever. Prior to that, why, it was our water. Our water was an old-fashioned pump that we pumped water with, and when we got electricity, then we drilled a deep well and put in a pump. And so those days were wonderful days, especially for my mother, who worked hard all her life, and all of a sudden things began to ease a little bit, because with water and with power, suddenly we had indoor toilets. And the old two-holer, as most people remember, went by the wayside, which was a wonderful thing. And so there were a lot of changes. Electricity came in, made lots of changes in our lifetime.
Okay, how about your early education? I know that I didn't get to know you until you came off the mountain and started to high school in about 35 or 6. Where did you go to school when you were a young child?
Well, I started the first grade at school, the Highland School, which is the area is located on the Paddock Road that many people are familiar with in this area. And I spent 8 years there, and rode horseback to school. It was a little tough in the wintertime getting to school, but that's where I spent my first 8 years. Then all of a sudden I found myself in high school, and moved to town with my grandmother Hopkins for 2 years, and then the school district began running a school bus up to our area, and so after that, I could stay home and commute to school that way.
Okay, after high school, I think you did go on and attend Washington State College, as it was known then. And you remember some of your experiences there in those early days? When they...
Well, of course, the big thing that I remember was that I insisted that I had to belong to a fraternity, because a lot of my friends belonged to fraternities, so I did join a fraternity, and spent 3 years at then was Washington State College, now the Washington State University. And not knowing what I wanted to do in those years, I had a pretty good singing voice, and I thought I'd study music. And I spent about 3 years singing with the college quartet and the college choir, and taking all kinds of music courses and that type of thing, until I finished my junior year. And in 1941, of course, we know what happened. The war came along, and I enlisted in what was then the Army Air Corps, and waited around to be called to active duty, and actually went on active duty out of college in 1943, the spring of 1943, and that sort of ended my college career because there was other things to do at the time. Fight a war.
Yeah, up to now, I suppose I should have been calling you Mr. Donahue, but now I suppose I should call you Colonel Donahue. I know that you went through flight school and that you went to England and flew B-17s in combat. Perhaps you could tell us some of your more memorable experiences, either daring or funny or whatever you want to do.
Well, of course, there were many experiences that occurred during that period of time. I spent about 24 months in England, flying B-17s in the 91st Bomb Group, which was the group, incidentally, that the Memphis Belle came from. And although the Memphis Belle was, and that crew were gone by the time I got there in the spring of 1944. But I think one of the most memorable experiences that I had during that time was on November the 2nd, 1944, which things that you never forget. Out of 36 airplanes in our group, we lost 16, shot down by flak and by fighters of Hermann Göring's yellow-nosed Me-109s. And so every November 2nd, I sort of remember that particular day, and I think I always will. It was an experience that you don't think about too often now, but it's an experience that you'll never forget, that's for sure. It was, you had fun. I learned to drink mild and bitters in the club over there, and I drank my first scotch and soda when I was in England. And I've shifted now to water, and so anyway, it was different.
Well, Colonel,
Now I'm a colonel.
you made reference to the Memphis Belle, and I'm sure you, as well as most of the pilots of that era, went to see the movie. I mean, how actually does that compare with the truth?
Well, a lot of it was, I thought, was depicted absolutely. The clothing, the conversations, and so forth were very, very good. The combat film that they showed in that movie was excellent, I thought. One thing that was wrong about the movie showed that there were wounded aboard on the last mission. That was not true. The wounded, there were no wounded on the last mission. In fact, the Memphis Belle buzzed the tower, which signified that this was the last mission, the 25th mission, and they were going home. If it had been wounded aboard, they would have come in on the final approach with shooting flares to indicate to the people on the ground that there were wounded. That did not happen. So that was the difference, I guess, in what I remember about the Memphis Belle.
Okay, a little later on in the interview, we'll try to photograph some of the photographs that you brought along, and the Memphis Belle is part of that. Okay, so you survived World War II, and when did your marriage take place? Was it while you were in the service?
I better remember this. We were married in March of 1944, my wife Evelyn, and before I went to the service. We were married in Salt Lake City, and then Evelyn came home when I went overseas, and that was of course something you remember too.
But then when you finished your tour and you came home and finished a few other duties that the Air Force had in line for you, then you started to raise a family. Perhaps you could give us their names. I won't embarrass you by asking you the dates.
Okay, don't do that. When I came home in 1945, I went back, of course, to the old family ranch and bought a piece of property at that time, and started to raise a family, and we ended up with 4 sons, and all but one are still living here in this area. Then later on, we moved off of the Highland. I mentioned the Cyrus place earlier in the interview, and that was the area that we bought. And then we moved later on to my wife's parents' farm out here on the Whetstone, known as the Barclay Farm, and where we live today. And our life is still farming, and that's something we've done all our life since the war.
Well, you deviated just a little bit from the normal type of farming. I mean, you got into raising thoroughbreds. I mean, how come you ever did this?
Well, the price of wheat kept going down, and I was trying to figure out some way to increase income. And so we started with one thoroughbred and one racehorse. And we raised, one time we had 13 mares, and we bred and raised thoroughbreds and sold them in the sale at Seattle. And for a while it was a very lucrative thing, and we had some nice horses. It's a little bit different today. The price of horses, like the price of wheat, has gone down. In fact, it happened about the same time. So we still raise a few horses. We still have a lot of fun with them. It's more of a hobby now than anything else. In the state of Washington, the horse situation, the racehorse situation, is a very questionable thing because, as you know, Long Acres Racetrack has been sold to Boeing. We have seen this happening, so we have a trainer that we made a deal with, and we have 6 horses at the present time running in Illinois. And everybody sort of looks at you like that's a little bit different, and it is a little bit different. But it's a lot of fun, and it doesn't cost us very much money, and we make a little income from it. But it's not a very lucrative thing.
You had one rather memorable success during the raising of thoroughbreds.
We had one, in fact, she was the 2-year-old of the year in the state of Washington. Her name was Run Home Honey. And She ran and won 5 stake races in the state. Of course, we lost her in Bay Meadows for a pretty good price. But we haven't had one since then like that.
Okay, Colonel, no, I guess I'm going to have to say Senator. I believe you have had some experience in the political scene. Would you care to tell us a little bit about that? Your father was a representative from this area for a long time. Just continue and tell us about
Well, my father, Dewey, was a member of the House of Representatives for 12 years and a member of the Senate for 8 years. So he spent 20 years. And when he was 70 years old, he decided that he'd been there long enough. And we were talking one day, and he said, "I'm going to retire." He said, "Why don't you run?" And of course, I didn't know anything about politics at all. But after he convinced me that I should, I ran against a fellow from Walla Walla and won. I ran in 1968, and my first session was 1969. And I served then 12 years in the Senate, and was a very enjoyable period of time.
Well, you must have felt some sense of accomplishment while you were there, Senator. I mean, can you recall some of the bills that perhaps you initiated or were successful in getting through the Senate?
Well, I think probably the achievement that was great as far as I was concerned was the fact that I was able to secure the position of chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in 1974, and was active in that particular committee until I retired in 1980. So that's 6 years. And during that period of time, there were several bills that were that I considered excellent as far as the public is concerned. And probably one that affects this area more than any other is the bill that passed called the Open Space Act, which I was the prime sponsor of. And it's been a very, very dollar-saving bill as far as agriculture is concerned throughout the state. There were many others. It was a tough deal at that time because
that open space bill sounds like a wonderful one, Hubert, but I've always believed that, understood that there is a certain amount of pork barreling, and there must be some things that you have done for Columbia County or the city of Dayton itself.
Well, of course, when you're in a position like that, nobody questions what you do very much. There was nothing dishonest about it, but I was able to, for instance, put about $65,000 in the budget that was allocated for restoration of the depot in Dayton, which I think more or less started the restoration. And it's been a wonderful thing for the community. Now, if that's pork barreling, why, that's all right too. Another one was that I was able to pass a bill that gave 1% of invested pari-mutuel monies throughout the state to be divided among small racetracks. Dayton, having a small racetrack, has received several $1,000s over the last several years, along with Walla Walla, with Waitsburg, and so forth. So, and those little things are things that you do for your community, and it's not unlike, I guess, what congressmen do today for their people in their state. But it makes you feel sort of good, and I think this start of $65,000 for the depot has been a wonderful thing for the community.
Okay, I think this probably takes us to the end of our interview. Hubert, we'll later on photograph some of the pictures that you've brought along and try to tell us. Thank you very much for being willing to show up and become a part of Columbia County's history.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to photograph a few of the pictures, clippings, that type of thing that Hubert has brought along. Now, Hubert, if you would explain them as you hold them up, they don't have to be in any certain order.
Okay. Here's a picture of, we mentioned the Memphis Belle. This is a picture of the Memphis Belle on its last mission that was taken at the 91st Bomb Group in England. Here's another one on its approach in to the air base after finishing its last mission. Here's a picture of my aircraft and it coming back from the mission that I mentioned on November the 2nd. My radio operator was killed in this particular picture. And to go on to something else, we mentioned horse racing, and here's a picture of one of our favorite horses. It's now running back in Illinois. This is a photo of, I have several of these, of winning shots that that you paste up on the wall, and we've got one wall that I haven't got much more room for. Then in the legislature, this was a picture or a copy of a newspaper article back when I was Ways and Means Chairman, and I'm sort of proud of that. They always said I was a stingy person, and that's what this particular article mentions. Actually, I don't think it was that. I think it was just that I was careful about the way that I allocated the people's money when I was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. This is a picture of activity on the floor of the Senate, and it shows that there were a few people in the Senate floor there at that particular time listening to what I had to say. This is a picture of Governor Dixie Lee Ray and my wife and myself, and I don't know what the conversation is all about, but I had a great admiration for her during the years that I spent in the legislature. Those are a few that I brought with me that I thought might be interesting.
Thank you.